Have you ever felt trapped in an emotional cycle where someone's presence in your life feels more like a burden than a blessing? What if I told you that the key to freedom isn't in holding on tighter, but in learning to let go? Today, we're going to explore the powerful rules that will help you emotionally detach from anyone and reclaim your inner peace. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood. People hear the word detach and assume it means becoming heartless, cold, or indifferent. But that's not the truth. Detachment, in its healthiest form, is not about shutting down emotionally. It's about regaining control over what you give your energy to and how much of yourself you pour into someone or something. It's the art of learning how to feel without falling apart, how to care without collapsing, and how to love without losing yourself. Emotional detachment is a skill, a discipline that's developed over time, especially when you've felt the cost of giving too much to people who didn't handle your heart with care. When you find yourself entangled emotionally with someone, whether it's a romantic partner, a friend, or even a family member, you begin to absorb not just their presence, but their patterns, their moods, and even their neglect. You start adjusting your day based on their behavior. You wake up thinking about what they said or didn't say, whether they'll reach out or leave you wondering. Slowly, without realizing it, you hand over the remote control of your emotions to someone else. They press play, pause, mute, and you respond. That's not connection. That's emotional dependency. And the deeper you go without setting boundaries, the harder it becomes to separate your emotions from theirs. Discipline, in this context, means choosing yourself every single time you're faced with chaos disguised as connection. It means recognizing that not every intense emotion is evidence of a deep bond. Sometimes it's just your attachment to the idea of what could be, not the reality of what is. To detach with discipline is to pause and ask yourself, is this relationship feeding me or bleeding me? And if it's the latter, it's time to create space, not out of anger, but out of wisdom. Detachment doesn't mean pushing someone away. It means placing yourself at the center of your life again. It means you stop orbiting around their world and come back home to yours. We are not built to absorb everyone's weight. You cannot carry someone's indifference on your shoulders and still walk with confidence. You cannot beg for consistency and still believe you're enough. Emotional detachment gives you back your posture. It allows you to stand tall, not because you don't feel, but because you've learned to manage your feelings without letting them control you. The discipline lies in knowing when to pull back, when to listen to the silence, and when to stop explaining your worth to people who were never listening. Most people think strength is staying no matter what, that holding on is the brave thing, but the real courage, that comes in the form of letting go with grace, of acknowledging that your peace is too expensive to be traded for someone's temporary attention or selective affection. Detachment teaches you to stop settling for emotional breadcrumbs when you're capable of baking your own bread. And that's the truth many avoid, because once you detach, you also have to confront the space that person used to occupy. But that space is not emptiness, it's opportunity. It's where you get to rebuild yourself without the influence of someone who only ever brought confusion, not clarity. Detachment is not passive. It's not simply waiting for time to heal you. It's active. It's removing the triggers, setting the boundaries, and protecting your focus. It's replacing overthinking with purpose. Instead of spending your day dissecting someone's behavior, you start planning yours. You stop rereading texts and start rereading your goals. You stop rehearsing conversations and start practicing self-respect. Emotional detachment done right is an act of self-love. You're not running from emotion, you're training it. You're learning to feel deeply but respond wisely. That takes work, patience, and most of all, discipline. Because let's be honest, it's easy to stay emotionally entangled. It's familiar, but what's familiar isn't always healthy. And what's easy doesn't always serve you. Detachment asks more of you. It requires you to lean into discomfort, to confront your habits, and to rewire how you've been taught to love. It demands honesty, not just about the other person, but about yourself, about why you stayed, why you ignored the signs, and why you're afraid to walk away. But here's the thing, once you begin to detach with intention, you start to see things clearly. You see people for who they are, not who you want them to be. You stop excusing inconsistency and start expecting respect. You no longer chase closure, you create it. You no longer need validation, you own your value. And slowly, the weight begins to lift. Not because you care less, but because you've chosen to care for yourself more. Letting go of expectations is one of the hardest but most freeing acts in any relationship or emotional connection. Expectations are often silent contracts we write in our minds without the other person ever signing. We create images of how they should treat us, how they should respond, how they should love us. And when they don't meet those standards, we feel hurt, not necessarily because they wronged us, but because they didn't follow the script we created in our heads. And that's the trap. We start to attach our emotional satisfaction to their behavior, and suddenly our peace is at the mercy of someone else's decisions. Think about it. We expect them to text us good morning. We expect them to apologize when they hurt us. We expect them to support us during difficult times. And while those expectations might seem reasonable, the danger lies in making them requirements for our happiness. When they don't follow through, we spiral, not because of the action itself, but because of what we expected that action to represent. We wanted them to show love. We wanted them to show care. And when they didn't, it felt personal. It felt like rejection, when in truth, it may simply be a difference in how we connect or communicate. Letting go of expectations doesn't mean lowering your standards. It means freeing yourself from the emotional chaos that comes when others don't behave according to your inner script. Standards are about how you allow people to treat you. Expectations are about what you assume they'll do. The difference is subtle but powerful. When you have standards, you can walk away if someone doesn't meet them. When you have expectations, you often stay, hoping they'll finally change. That hope becomes a cycle. You wait, they disappoint. You hope, they pull away. You get angry, they don't understand. And now you're drained, emotionally, mentally, even physically. The emotional discipline to let go of expectations starts with honesty. You have to ask yourself, am I upset about what happened, or am I upset because I assumed something would happen differently? That question alone can change how you process emotional pain. It gives you clarity. It separates your needs from your assumptions. When you begin to let go of expectations, you stop scripting people and start observing them. You watch how they show up, not how you wish they would. You pay attention to their patterns instead of their potential, and in that space of clarity, you make better decisions. You stop begging for change and start choosing peace. Expectations are often rooted in fantasy. We romanticize people. We fall in love with the version of them we see in our mind, not necessarily the one that's in front of us. And when the illusion starts to fade, we feel betrayed, but not by them, by our own imagination. Emotional detachment is about confronting that illusion. It's about seeing someone clearly, accepting who they are, and deciding if you can live with that version of them, not the one you hoped they'd become. And if you can't, then the choice becomes obvious. You step back, not because you don't care, but because you refuse to continue investing in a one-sided vision. Another layer of letting go of expectations is self-awareness. You need to know where those expectations came from in the first place. Were they based on your past, on how someone else treated you, on what you see in movies or online? Sometimes we carry wounds from previous relationships and apply those rules to new ones. We expect over-communication because someone in the past ghosted us. We expect validation because someone made us feel invisible. We expect reassurance because someone else was unpredictable. These triggers create unrealistic emotional demands, not because we're broken, but because we haven't healed. Letting go of expectations forces us to look inward. It forces us to take accountability for our emotional baggage, so we stop expecting others to carry it. When you let go of expectations, you start practicing acceptance. You allow people to be who they are, and more importantly, you allow yourself to be free from constant disappointment. You stop waiting for them to call. You stop waiting for them to validate your feelings. You stop depending on them for emotional fulfillment. That kind of detachment doesn't make you cold. It makes you clear. It gives you space to breathe. It gives you room to rebuild your emotional boundaries and live from a place of intention rather than reaction. Because in the end, the only thing you truly control is how you show up. And that's more powerful than trying to control how others do. Creating emotional distance without guilt is one of the most powerful inner skills a person can develop. It's not about cutting people off or becoming cold. It's about learning to honor your own well-being, even when your emotions are deeply tied to someone else. The guilt comes in because we've often been taught that caring means constant access, that love means being available no matter the cost, and that emotional closeness should never waver. But that's not true. Emotional closeness should be earned and respected, not assumed. When someone repeatedly disappoints you, disrespects your boundaries, or drains your energy, it's not unkind to take a step back. It's necessary. The guilt creeps in because you still care. You still have that emotional connection, that history, those shared moments. You still remember how they made you laugh, how they once showed up for you, and how you imagined things would continue. So, when the time comes to create distance, even for your own health, it feels like you're betraying that memory. But here's the truth. Honoring your emotional needs doesn't dishonor your history. It simply acknowledges the present. Emotional distance isn't always visible. It doesn't always mean walking away physically. Sometimes it means letting go of the emotional weight you've been carrying, the responsibility for their moods, the hope they'll change, the pressure to fix what isn't yours to fix. It's choosing to stop checking your phone every hour for their message. It's deciding not to justify their actions to your friends anymore. It's refusing to keep making excuses for someone who no longer shows up the way you need, and that decision is not rooted in anger. It's rooted in clarity. The guilt you feel is often connected to your empathy. You don't want to hurt them. You don't want to make them feel abandoned. You imagine how your distance might make them feel, and suddenly your own peace becomes negotiable. But this is where emotional maturity comes in. You realize that you can be compassionate without being consumed. You can care without clinging. You can love from a distance when closeness is hurting more than healing. And when you reach that point, you're not giving up on them. You're choosing not to give up on yourself. There's also guilt that stems from societal conditioning. We're told that strong people stay, that real friends don't walk away, that true love means weathering every storm together. But what those ideas often ignore is the how the other person treats you, how they make you feel, how your emotional state changes every time they enter or exit your life. Creating distance doesn't mean you didn't try. It means you finally realized that continuing to try was costing too much. And when that realization sets in, guilt starts to lose its grip. Emotional detachment is not the absence of love. It's the presence of boundaries. And boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. They don't block people out, they protect your peace. When you create space between yourself and someone who's no longer aligned with your emotional needs, you're not punishing them. You're simply protecting the version of yourself that's been neglected in the process. That version deserves attention. It deserves care. It deserves to be your priority, Often the guilt also ties back to identity. You might see yourself as the fixer, the nurturer, the one who always understands, always forgives, always stays. And stepping out of that role can feel like losing a part of who you are. But here's a shift to consider. Maybe the real strength isn't in how long you hold on. Maybe it's in how bravely you choose to let go of the role, the dynamic, the illusion, and in that space, you rediscover who you are when your energy is no longer invested in someone who doesn't return it. There's power in saying, I can love you and still choose myself. There's freedom in no longer explaining why you're not as available, why your messages are shorter, why you don't react the way you used to. That emotional distance isn't coldness, it's calm. It's the kind of calm that comes after chaos. It's the peace that follows the storm you kept standing in, long after you should have left. And when you start to feel that peace more than guilt, you'll know you're healing. Because emotional distance doesn't mean you've stopped caring. It means you've started caring about yourself just as much. 2/2. Letting go of unrealistic expectations is one of the most liberating things you can do for yourself when trying to emotionally detach from someone. Expectations are powerful because they're rooted in hope. You expect someone to change, to apologize, to understand you, to return the same kind of love and effort you've been giving them. But when those expectations remain unmet over and over again, they don't just disappoint you, they exhaust you, mentally and emotionally, and that exhaustion becomes the very thing that keeps you stuck, constantly waiting for someone else to become what you need, rather than accepting them for what they are. People often build emotional attachments on the idea of potential. You see what someone could be, what the relationship could turn into, how things might improve with time, so you hold on. You hold on through the pain, through the confusion, through the silence, because of what might happen someday. But the truth is, potential isn't a guarantee. It's not a promise. It's a projection, and often it's built more on your hope than their actual behavior. Letting go of unrealistic expectations doesn't mean you stop believing in people. It means you stop betting your peace on someone else's transformation. When you let go of what you wish they'd do or who you wish they'd become, you free yourself from the constant cycle of waiting for them to respond differently, to treat you better, to value your presence the way you've been valuing theirs. But waiting can become a trap. It can keep you emotionally anchored to someone who's no longer showing up, and you don't realize it at first, but your emotional health becomes tied to their every move. One kind word from them lifts you up. One cold gesture pulls you right back down. That's not connection. That's dependence. It's important to recognize the gap between what is and what you want it to be. When you're caught up in emotional attachment, the mind tends to romanticize the good moments, the sweet words, the glimpses of care. It magnifies them and holds them as proof that the story isn't over yet. But when those moments are scattered between long stretches of neglect or emotional inconsistency, they become more like breadcrumbs than signs of real nourishment. Letting go of unrealistic expectations means seeing the full picture, not just the parts that made you feel good. Many people stay emotionally entangled because they keep telling themselves, maybe next time it'll be different. That hope, while natural, becomes a burden. It keeps you in a loop of emotional investment with little return. And what's worse is that you start adjusting your needs to fit their limitations. You start accepting less, rationalizing their behavior, and slowly disconnecting from your own self-worth. Letting go of expectations isn't just about them. It's about reconnecting to your own standards, your own sense of value. When you emotionally detach by releasing expectations, you start to see people for who they are in the present moment, not for who they were in the past, or who you want them to be in the future. You begin to relate to them based on what's real, not what's imagined, and in that clarity, a kind of peace forms. You no longer need closure from them, because your own realization becomes the closure. You no longer need them to change, because you've changed how you engage. You're no longer hoping for a version of the relationship that only exists in your head. You're now grounded in the truth. This shift doesn't happen overnight. There's grief in letting go of expectations, grief over the version of them you created, grief over the story you were trying to write together, grief over the emotional return that never came. But once you allow that grief to pass through you, it leaves behind wisdom. You become more emotionally resilient, more selective about who gets access to your inner world, and more aware of when you're slipping into the trap of wishful thinking instead of reality. Letting go of unrealistic expectations is not bitterness, it's emotional responsibility. It's choosing to stop asking someone to meet you in a place they've shown they don't want to go. It's no longer building your peace around someone else's potential. And most of all, it's understanding that emotional detachment isn't about giving up on people. It's about no longer abandoning yourself. When you let go of what you wished would happen, you make space for what can happen, for healing, for clarity, and for relationships that honor your presence instead of testing your patience. Reclaiming your identity is a powerful step in the process of emotional detachment. When you've been emotionally invested in someone for a long time, especially in a deep or intense relationship, parts of who you are naturally start to intertwine with them. It's not always obvious at first. You start adjusting your schedule around them, making decisions with them in mind, or filtering your emotions through the lens of how they might respond. Slowly, you begin to drift away from your original self, not because you're weak, but because connection often involves compromise. But when that connection becomes one-sided or unhealthy, that same compromise starts to chip away at your sense of identity. You might find yourself questioning what you enjoy without them around. The music, the places, the jokes, all these things become attached to memories you built with that person. It's like they became the background music to your life, and now that they're gone, everything feels silent. That silence, though uncomfortable, is where your identity waits to be heard again. Reclaiming it means you no longer define your worth by your proximity to them. It means reintroducing yourself to yourself with curiosity instead of judgment. When people stay emotionally attached, it's often because they feel lost without the emotional anchor that person provided. But that anchor, if not mutual or healthy, can turn into a weight. Reclaiming your identity is the act of releasing that weight. Not because the other person was bad, but because you've outgrown the version of yourself that needed their validation to feel whole. You don't need to be anyone's second thought just to feel like someone's first choice. That understanding doesn't come from a moment, it comes from a process. A slow, deliberate decision to rediscover what lights you up without anyone else's input. Think back to who you were before the emotional attachment began. What did you love? What dreams did you have that didn't require permission or approval from anyone else? There is something incredibly empowering about tapping back into those parts of you. It's not about going backward, it's about reconnecting with a foundation that was always yours. When you've been entangled in someone else's story, reclaiming your identity feels like writing your identity, feels like writing your own name at the top of the page again. And the more you do that, the less power their absence has over your presence. This process also includes setting new boundaries, not just with them, but with yourself. You begin to notice when your mind wanders back into old habits or emotional loops, and instead of indulging them, you redirect your focus. It's not always easy. Sometimes it feels like tearing yourself away from something that still matters to you. But every time you choose your peace over that emotional replay, you get a little stronger. You realize that detachment isn't about becoming cold, it's about becoming clear. You also start to notice how your language changes. You stop saying things like, "I don't know who I am without them," and start saying, "I'm figuring out who I am again." That shift is quiet, but monumental. It means you're no longer waiting for someone else to define your identity. You're stepping into it yourself. The people who belong in your life won't blur that identity. They'll respect and support it, and the ones who leave because of it, that's not your loss. The beauty of reclaiming your identity is that it reminds you that you were never incomplete. You may have shared your heart, your time, your dreams, but those things were gifts, not contracts. And just because they weren't fully received doesn't mean they lost value. What you gave came from a real place, but now it's time to give that same energy to yourself. This stage of emotional detachment also means rewriting your narrative. You begin to tell yourself a new story, one where you're not a character in someone else's life, but the author of your own. You stop assigning meaning to every missed call or distant conversation and start assigning meaning to your own actions, your own progress. You give yourself permission to take up space again, not as someone recovering from loss, but as someone rebuilding from strength. And perhaps the most important part of reclaiming your identity is learning to enjoy your own company again. You don't need to fill the silence with someone else's voice to feel complete. You begin to understand that solitude isn't emptiness, it's clarity. It's the space where you remember your worth, recalibrate your energy, and reset your standards. You're not becoming someone new. You're becoming more of who you've always been. Letting go of emotional guilt is one of the most liberating and necessary steps in detaching from someone. Guilt is a heavy emotion that can hold you hostage long after the relationship has ended or the connection has faded. It lingers in the back of your mind, questioning every decision you made, every word you said, and every boundary you tried to set. It convinces you that maybe you should have done more. Maybe you were too cold. Maybe if you had just been more patient or more understanding, things could have turned out differently. But this kind of thinking is a trap. Guilt keeps you emotionally tied to the past, replaying events over and over again with the illusion that you're doing something useful. In reality, all you're doing is punishing yourself for things that are already done, and often the guilt doesn't even belong to you. It's inherited from expectations, assumptions, and emotional manipulation, whether it came from the other person or your own belief system. There's a difference between taking responsibility and carrying guilt. Responsibility means acknowledging your part, learning from it, and growing. Guilt means dwelling on it to the point where it paralyzes your present. When you're emotionally attached to someone, and especially when that attachment begins to break or needs to end, guilt often steps in as a distraction. It tells you that detaching means you're giving up, or that it makes you selfish or unkind. But there's nothing selfish about choosing peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, or healing over hurting. Sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is walk away, not only for your own well-being, but to allow both people the space to grow separately. Letting go of guilt means giving yourself permission to move on without dragging the weight of what-ifs and should-haves along with you. One of the ways guilt keeps you stuck is by creating a distorted sense of responsibility for someone else's emotions. You begin to think, if I leave, they'll be hurt, or they need me even if I'm not happy. That mindset keeps you tethered to someone, not out of love, but out of obligation. And obligation, when it overrides your own emotional health, slowly becomes resentment. Resentment doesn't just affect your relationship with them, it begins to infect your relationship with yourself. Letting go of guilt is reclaiming your emotional integrity. It's a declaration that your needs, your boundaries, and your truth are just as valid as anyone else's. The process isn't instant. Letting go of guilt takes conscious effort. It begins with challenging the thoughts that fuel it. You ask yourself, is this guilt serving me, or is it sabotaging me? You remind yourself that setting a boundary doesn't make you cruel. Saying no doesn't mean you're cold. Choosing to prioritize your emotional health doesn't make you the villain. It makes you self-aware, and self-awareness is a sign of strength, not selfishness. As you release guilt, you start to notice how much energy you've been spending justifying your feelings. You stop over-explaining your actions, trying to earn forgiveness for choosing what's best for you. You realize that not everyone will understand your decisions, and you're not here to meet everyone's expectations. You're here to live in alignment with what feels right to you. That kind of clarity is powerful. It silences the voice of guilt because it's replaced by the voice of reason and inner truth. It also helps to look at guilt through the lens of compassion. Sometimes, guilt is just grief in disguise. You're grieving what could have been, the potential you saw, the love you tried to give. It's okay to feel that. But there's a difference between honoring your feelings and letting them control you. When guilt takes the wheel, it drives you in circles. But when you acknowledge it and release it, you finally give yourself permission to move forward, not with regret, but with understanding. Letting go of emotional guilt doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning. It means taking the lesson and leaving the pain. You hold on to the growth, not the grief. You stop making decisions based on how guilty you'll feel and start making them based on how free you'll become. And eventually that freedom becomes the foundation for healthier connections in the future. Relationships built not on guilt and fear, but on mutual respect, clarity, and emotional honesty. In the end, emotionally detaching from someone isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about reclaiming your peace, your clarity, and your power. It's about understanding that your emotional well-being matters, and that holding on, when it's hurting you, only delays your healing. These 7 rules aren't meant to harden your heart. They're meant to protect it. They are your tools for self-respect, for emotional discipline, and for moving forward without bitterness. Detachment isn't giving up on love. It's giving up on what no longer serves your growth, because the more you release what weighs you down, the lighter your spirit becomes, and the closer you get to the life, the love, and the peace that you truly deserve.